a sewing lesson from Sew New York. Today I'm going to teach you how to sew a proper 5/8 of an inch seam on the sewing machine. Hi, welcome to Sew New York. I'm McCracken, and today's lesson is going to be on sewing seams. I'm going to teach you how to sew a proper seam at the sewing machine. And the seam is going to be based on 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, which is what is used in commercial patterns. And I'm going to show you two samples. We'll see how to sew a seam that's pinned and then how to sew a seam that's basted. So let's go take a look and let's go sew the seams now. This will be the demonstration on the seam when it's pinned together and there's no basting. So I'm going to explain a few things first before we actually sew it on the machine. First of all, we want to pin the fabric together, and you want to make sure that you are pinning your fabric, the clean edges, the cut edges where your seam is going to be. They want to be perfectly aligned, but you don't want to see this sort of thing happening. Right now, they're not matching, they're apart. And that's about 1/8 of an inch. And say you had you're making a dress or a skirt and there's 3 or 4 seams. If you're off by 1/8 of an inch on all your seams, 4 times 1/8 of an inch is a 1/2 inch. And usually it could happen that you might be off even with your stitch line by more. So everything has to be measured and perfect, or the garment will be either size too big or too small. That 1/8 of an inch looks like it's nothing, but it really adds up. So we want to pin the edges perfectly together. And I'm going to explain a little bit about pinning. Some people will pin a seam with the pins going in this direction, and it's not wrong, but I'm going to explain why pinning this way and pinning another way, one is better than the other. So if you pin in this direction, I'm going to put a few pins into my seam. And don't forget, we're working with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So when I put this into the machine, I've got these 2 layers of fabric. The feed dog on the machine, which is the teeth that are underneath the foot, they're flat on the surface of the sewing bed. Those teeth are putting a different pressure onto the bottom piece of fabric, and then when you put the pressure foot down on top in the machine, that's a different pressure on top. So you start to sew, and what will happen is that the pins, because they're in this direction, can slide, and by the time you get all the way down to the bottom, there's 2 different pressures happening, and you can end up being off the bottom. See that? So we don't want that to happen. It can be more than that sometimes. So you want to put your pins perpendicular to the edge that you're pinning. And I'll show you that. So we're going to take the pins out that we have here, and we're going to turn them this way. Now the head of the pin can be here as well as it can be over here. Here or there. But you want to pin in this direction, and I'll explain this to you now. When you pin in this direction, the fabric's locked in. It can't shift all the way down at the bottom. By the time you get to the bottom sewing, the fabric rather, is still the same. So you want to pin in this direction, and I try to maintain this kind of pinning when I'm pinning the pattern down to the fabric, when I'm pinning my seams. Just in general, I always pin when I'm basting my seams, I pin in this direction. It's just a good habit to create. Okay, and also now, if you're sewing with pins, and you're going to sew over the pins, they have to go in this direction. You cannot sew over pins when they are going in this direction. You'd have to pull them out as you go, which also would throw your seam off if you're pulling them out. So you want to keep your pins in this direction. It keeps everything slipping and everything stays the same. So I'm just going to finish putting a few more pins down to the bottom. So the whole piece of fabric, our whole seam is pinned from top to bottom. All right, now we're going to take it to the machine and we're going to sew it up. But I'm going to show you first a little bit about the machine. So hang on one second, I'm going to zoom the camera. The camera is zoomed in. Maybe I can get a little bit closer. Pretty good. All right. What I want you to see are the lines that are on this plate right here, the metal plate, on the side of the foot. Here's your foot, and there's these lines. There's 1, 2, 3. This machine has 3 lines. Some machines will have more, and some machines have none. The purpose of these lines, it's a measurement for your seam allowance. I put a piece of tape here because, in case you can't see the lines, because I want you to realize that that's the 5/8 of an inch, and that is our guide for sewing the seam. If your machine does not have any seam allowances, you can put tape, if your machine does not have any of these lines, you can put a ruler in here and you can measure from the needle. So the needle is right here. I'm going to take a measurement. Scale is right here. I've put a piece of tape down. That measures 5/8 of an inch from a needle. If you go to the line just before it, which is right here, that's 1/2 an inch. That's 3/8. And then on this machine, if you're doing a 1/4 of an inch seam, you could follow the edge of the foot right here. You would put your fabric. Now we're at the machine and we're going to sew the seam at 5/8 of an inch. And again, this is our muslin, and we're sewing. I'm going to show you the sample of how to do a proper seam with just pins. So you want to start at the beginning of the fabric at the top. Always start at the beginning of the fabric. Make sure your needle isn't coming down here at 1/2 an inch. You want to start at the beginning of your seam. And then you're going to slide the fabric in so it lines right. It butts up right next to, there should be no space in between the fabric and your 5/8 measurement. Okay, put the foot down. Now, as far as your eye, this is another thing. I like to use this tape, and this is how I teach my students. You want to keep your eye lower over here, looking at the tape. You're not even looking at your fabric. You're looking at the tape or the 5/8 marker. All right. You want to look ahead because if you have the fabric set up, this is about an inch below the needle. From here to here is about an inch. If the fabric is set up at 5/8 of an inch here, you can be sure by the time you get to the needle, you'll be at 5/8. If you're just looking right next to your measurement at 5/8 right over here, the fabric could be off at the bottom, and there's no guarantee. It's probably going to be too narrow a seam by the time it gets to the needle. So keep your eye ahead of the foot. That way you're going to sew a nice seam. When you sew a seam, you're going to take a few stitches, like 3 or 4. Okay, and then you're going to back tack. Back tacking is a reverse. It locks your stitch in. So back tacking is 2 directions. You go back and then you go forward. So let's back tack to the beginning. Okay, and now we're going to go forward, and now we're going to sew all the way to the bottom, keeping your eye over here at the 5/8. So we're going to sew all the way to the bottom, and then we'll back tack. And we'll take a look at it. Okay, I'm going to back tack at this point. Back tacking is 2 directions, about 3 or 4 stitches back, and then the same forward. Okay, so we've done our seam over the pins. Let's take a look at it. Slide it out, leave enough thread for the machine, and let's just cut it off right here at the bottom. Okay, and there's our finished seam. We'll take the pins out, and then you would go and press it. So in this part, I'm going to show you how to sew a proper seam that has been basted. And basting is a temporary stitch that you use to hold your seam together before you sew it at the machine, and then you take the basting out after you finish the seam. So here you see again a seam. It's 2 layers of fabric, and it's pinned and basted. We pinned it first in the manner that I explained in the last section. So your pins go in this direction, And the basting has been done. There's a knot in the end. The basting's been done at 5/8 of an inch. Basically, I use this ruler, and if you watch my basting video, you'll see me teach you what the purpose is for this ruler. It helps to train your eye. Now, you don't have to use a ruler, but it's a good idea in the beginning because your eye will become accustomed to understanding and knowing the difference between a 5/8 seam allowance or a 1/2 inch seam allowance. All right, now we're going to remove the pins. So go to my basting video and you can see how to baste. Now I'm going to put this in to the 5/8 seam allowance. Again, this seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch, which is a standard seam allowance that you'll find on most sewing patterns. If you want to, you can pull the knot, pull your thread up. That way the knot does not get caught in the stitching. And again, you're going to bring this into the beginning of the stitch line at the top of your seam, and you want to line it up completely correct with your, completely flush, I should say, with the tape. The tape is at 5/8 of an inch. You're going to put the presser foot down, and you're going to take a couple stitches and back tack. Back tack is 2 directions, forward and back at the beginning. And now you're going to sew and go all the way to the bottom, keeping your eye at your edge of your 5/8, about an inch below where the needle stitches. Take your time. And when you sew, you can stop and go. You don't have to just sew all the way down. So it's normal to sew and stop. And if you've been sewing a long time, yes, you might sew fast and go all the way down. But just take your time. It's more important that the seam is correct. And it's important to have a little bit of patience when you're sewing. And when you get to the bottom, you're going to do your back tack. About 3 or 4 stitches back, and then you're going to go forward. Great. Lift up the foot and slide it out. If it's stuck, turn the wheel. Leave enough thread for the machine, and then you're going to cut your threads off at the very end of your seam. So you want to cut the threads right off because you're done with the seam. Don't leave any extra threads for later on. Then your garment just has threads everywhere, and you have to spend a lot of time, cutting them off later on. So then you're going to go back, and now you're going to take out the basting. And don't worry if the basting's been caught in the stitches. Usually it pulls right out. If the fabric is really delicate, then just cut it out if it gets stuck. Otherwise, you can usually just pull it right through, and that's coming right out, as you can see. Okay, the basting is all out. I'm going to cut the threads at this end. And then, after you sew the seam, you want to press the seam. Now we're going to get ready to press the seam. Whenever you sew a seam, you should be pressing the seam. You might have the prettiest fabric, and maybe you sew the most beautiful straight seams, but if the seam isn't pressed correctly, the garment's going to end up on the sale rack. So it's good to have a good steam iron. It doesn't have to be an expensive iron. And you're going to want to turn the fabric to the inside or the back side where your seam is, and you're going to just put the iron right into the stitch line and press it nice and flat all the way down. And that's pressing the seam flat. I want to mention one more thing about seams. So this is just muslin, and yes, it's plain on both sides. This is the correct side. Whenever you sew a seam, a dart is a seam, there's flat felled seams. All seams, this is a plain seam. This is the proper 5/8 of an inch plain seam. All seams, you always put the good side together and you sew on the wrong side, or you're putting the right side of the fabric together and you're sewing on the inside. So this seam is pressed nice and flat and it looks perfect, and that's what you want to do all the time. So that's your 5/8 of an inch seam. Have a good day. See you at the next lesson.